Hello, this is Rick Reardon. In this video lecture, we're going to introduce you to the ICD-10 code book for diagnosis coding. We'll cover the layout of the book. We'll talk about abbreviations and other things you'll need to be successful in ICD-10 CM coding. Okay, so this is the introduction to the ICD-10 CM codebook. There is a separate codebook for ICD-10 PCS codes, which is listed in the PCS codebook. ICD-10-CM is used for all diagnosis coding, which includes health status coding. You can kind of think of this as the reason the patient has come in to the clinic or has been admitted to the hospital. It consists of the alphabetic index, where you look up codes by the main term, which we'll get to in a bit, and the tabular. Many conditions in the codebook can be found in more than one place. Some important things to keep in mind. You can find things under the main term of complication as well as the name of the condition. OB conditions can be found in more than one place as well by using the main terms of delivery, pregnancy, puerperal, and then disease or syndrome, right? Disease is a popular one, for instance, COPD or chronic obstructive lung disease. The main term and the path you would use would be disease. Disease of what? Lung, and then obstructive lung disease. So you can find these things in more than one way. Now, more about main terms. Main terms are printed in bold and they're listed in alphabetical order on the far left-hand margin of each column in your code books. Main terms represent the diseases such as influenza or bronchitis, the conditions such as fatigue, fracture, injury, and also nouns such as disease, disorder, or syndrome, right? They can also represent adjectives such as double, kink, large. Some other things that you can look at, a popular one, pay attention to disease or syndrome. If you see it in the condition's title or description, that's a hint that you might want to start there for the main term. Subterms are called essential modifiers, and they are listed in the alphabetic index farther to the right, one standard indentation. These are also listed in alphabetical order. You need to review all subterms following the main term to make sure you get the correct code. Carryover lines are used when you have main terms or subterms because the number of words doesn't fit on a single line of print. These are indented 2 indents over. Here's an example of what we're talking about. Go to your code books and then look under the main term delivery. Then go find the subterm that's cesarean, or occurring after 32 weeks of gestation, but before 39 weeks of gestation. And that will tell you what we are talking about. Non-essential modifiers are other terms that appear in parentheses. These terms, what we mean by non-essential is they don't change the correct code assignment. They may or may not be seen in the diagnostic statement, but it has no effect on what the selection of the code is. And there's an example at the bottom of this slide. Pneumonia, you might see acute pneumonia, double pneumonia, migratory pneumonia, septic pneumonia, what have you. It doesn't change the code assignment. Eponyms, these are proper names. So these are the name of a disease that's derived by a physician or scientist who first identified the condition or devised the object that's being named after. And some examples of this would be Crohn's disease, Wickets syndrome, right? In other words, these are diseases, syndromes, disorders that are named for somebody. Eisenmenger syndrome, which is a congenital cardiological condition, right? Named for Eisenmenger. See and see also. You'll also see these terms, not trying to be funny here, in the code books. What does this mean? What's the difference between see and see also? See is a mandatory direction telling you that you have to go and look at whatever it's referenced in the alphabetic index. See also provides direction to look elsewhere. It's not necessary, but you may want to see also just to confirm that you're on the right coding path. Code also is a note when two codes are required. Notice I said the word required. So if you have dementia with Parkinson's disease, as illustrated here, you have to assign both codes. Right. And in that particular order. So dementia with Parkinson's disease, we would have the Parkinson's code G20 and then the F02.80. A default code is the code that's listed next to the main term in the alphabetic index. This means that the condition is most commonly associated with this main term. It's an unspecified code for the condition. Remember, we always want to code to the highest level of detail, otherwise referred to as specificity. So the default codes are used when the condition is documented without additional information to describe it. The tabular list lists all codes and it's divided into 22 chapters. And for some chapters, the body or organ system is the axis. Other chapters group conditions together by the etiology, or in other words, the nature of the disease process. We also have chapters for external causes of morbidity and factors influencing health status in contact with health services. In other words, the Z codes that we'll get into later this week. Codes have a specific code format and structure. All codes contain either letters or numbers. At minimum, they have 3 characters, such as I-10, I-10. Some categories are either 4 or 5 characters long. So therefore, codes need to be either 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 characters long. A category is 3 characters that represent a single disease or a group of related conditions. And then we have a sub-disease after a particular category. So we have that 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th characters, right? With the 4th characters, 8 is used to other specified, and the 4th character of 9, which you'll become more familiar with, is an unspecified condition. The first character in ICD-10-CM is always going to be an alphabetic character, such as I-10. All letters in the alphabet are used. The first three are the category, and the next three cover the etiology, followed by the anatomic site and the severity. And then the seventh character adds specificity. So it could be laterality, could be some other level of detail, meaning the specificity. ICD-10-CM also uses a placeholder character X, and this gets confusing. You don't always need to assign it, right? The one thing about using the X, we use it for future expansion. So when we need to assign a seventh character and a code has fewer than 6 characters, we use that placeholder X to make sure the seventh character actually goes in the seventh position. If you don't need a seventh character, you don't need to use a placeholder X. Certain codes have the seventh character, and these are marked in the tabular. And the seventh character absolutely must go in the seventh place. If a code requires a seventh character as per the tabular, but does not contain 6 characters, we therefore use the placeholder X to make sure the seventh character goes in the seventh position. And again, as mentioned before, the code characters are at least 3, no more than 7 characters. First character must always be a letter, must always be alphabetic. Second character is always numeric. And characters 3 through 7 can be either alphabetical or numeric. A decimal is always placed after the first 3 characters. Alphabetic characters are not case sensitive, and only complete codes are used for reporting, not categories and not subcategories. If you just put a code category on a claim and try to bill it, it will be rejected. And when a seventh character is required, we must use the X as a placeholder to make sure that the seventh character goes in the seventh position. I hope you find that useful. Please reach out if you have any questions about this material. Bye now.